What if the most consequential military decision of this decade was made not out of strategic clarity, but out of something far more fragile, the need to appear strong? What if the generals who were supposed to advise the most powerful military commander on earth said no, put their concerns in writing, and were ignored anyway? And what if the political movement that built itself entirely on the promise of ending forever wars is now watching those promises burn in real time, with cameras rolling, with the receipts right there on video for anyone willing to look? This is not a story about missiles. It is not a story about Iran. At its core, this is a story about how American power actually works when the gap between what is promised and what is delivered becomes too wide to hide. Stay with me, because the layers underneath this conflict are unlike anything we have seen in a generation. To understand what is happening right now, you cannot start with the first strike. You have to go back further. Back to the silence. A very particular kind of silence. The kind that settles into a room when senior military officers realize that the people above them are not going to listen, and they begin documenting everything, carefully, for the record. According to reporting from CNN, senior military leaders, including members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, formally raised serious documented concerns about the risks of a wider regional war before the strikes on Iran were ever authorized. These were not whispers in a hallway. These were direct briefings to the President of the United States. The concerns were specific. As a full-scale military attack on Iran could cost American lives. More critically, it could dangerously degrade already depleted weapon stockpiles. Sit with that phrase for a moment. Already depleted. We are not talking about a military operating at full capacity. We are talking about an arsenal drawn down by years of commitments in Ukraine, across the Pacific, throughout the Middle East. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Kane, reportedly told the president directly that the cost of going in would be measured in lives and in long-term strategic capacity. These are not abstract concerns. These are the assessments of people whose entire professional purpose is to understand exactly what a military operation will cost before it begins. Had President Trump dismissed a Washington Post report that General Kane had expressed reservations as, in his own words, 100% incorrect. But CNN then confirmed that the concerns were real, that they came from multiple senior military leaders, that they were raised during formal briefings with the president and his national security team. That leaves only two possibilities. Either the president was unaware of what his own top military advisors were telling him, which would be a failure of command, or he was fully aware, chose to proceed anyway, and then went on television and denied it ever happened, which would be a failure of credibility. Neither option is reassuring. And at the highest levels of military command, credibility is not a minor issue. It is the foundation everything else rests on. Now let us walk through what actually happened, because this story has layers, and each layer changes how you understand the one beneath it. The United States launched strikes on Iranian targets, not surgical strikes, not symbolic gestures, full-scale military operations, and in the days that followed, additional strikes continued. The most controversial among them resulted in the deaths of nearly 150 people. As of the time of this reporting, investigators, people whose professional purpose is to reconstruct the forensics of military violence, concluded that the strike was likely carried out by United States military forces. Think carefully about what that means. Not alleged. Not disputed. Investigators are saying the United States likely killed approximately 150 people in a single strike. And among those killed, the reporting points to a school. And the official response from the administration? The president addressed it directly. His words were, roughly, that casualties often happen in war and that there will likely be more. That was the statement. No detailed accounting. No announced investigation. No acknowledgement directed at the families of those who died. Just an acceptance of the outcome as an operational reality. A former soldier, reflecting publicly on these events, put it this way. He described watching people who have never experienced the weight of military violence, who cannot imagine what it feels like when a friend is killed, or when you watch someone you care about be torn apart, celebrating what is happening. And then watching those same people describe the deaths as simply what happens in war. And his point was direct. It is not what happens to them. It is what happens to us. That is not political analysis. That is testimony from someone who understands what these decisions actually cost in the physical world, not in a briefing room. Here is where the story becomes structurally complicated in a way that matters enormously. The stated justifications for the military operation shifted. Not once. According to members of Congress who attended classified briefings and have spoken publicly, the goals of the operation changed 4 or 5 times within a matter of days. First, the justification centered on Iran's missile program. The administration pointed to the threat posed by long-range Iranian missiles. But there was an immediate problem. Yet administration officials had previously claimed that Iran's nuclear sites had been completely and totally obliterated in an earlier operation, so the question becomes unavoidable. If the threat was already neutralized, why was it still the justification for continued action? When a journalist pressed the administration directly on this contradiction, the official response was a reaffirmation of confidence. The administration stood by the claim that the nuclear sites had been destroyed, and that the uranium stockpiles were no longer where they had been. That confidence, it turns out, was not universally shared within the intelligence community. Conflicting assessments did not disappear simply because an official used the word confident with authority. Then the justification shifted again, this time toward the protection of American allies. And that shift opened a different and sharper line of questioning from members of Congress, because if the primary threat was to Israel and not to the United States directly, the legal and constitutional foundation of the entire operation changes fundamentally. A Democratic congressman stood on the floor of the House and stated it plainly. There was no imminent threat to the United States by Iran. There was a threat to Israel. If a threat to Israel is to be treated as equivalent to an imminent threat to the United States, then the United States has entered genuinely uncharted legal and constitutional territory, and here is where the contradiction becomes impossible to paper over. The Pentagon briefing given to congressional staffers directly contradicted the narrative coming out of the White House. Pentagon briefers told staffers that the scenario was not that Iran was planning to attack the United States directly. The scenario was that if Iran were attacked by someone else, and that someone else was Israel, then Iran would respond against American assets and personnel in the region. Those two narratives are mutually exclusive. Either Iran was planning an imminent strike on American interests, justifying a preemptive defensive action, or the United States entered this conflict to prevent Iranian retaliation against a third-party strike by Israel. The administration has presented both versions at different times. Secretary of State Rubio communicated one version. Pentagon briefers communicated another. When the media accurately reported the contradiction, the White House pushed back on the reporting. This is not a communications problem. This is a structural credibility problem. And in international affairs, structural credibility problems have consequences that outlast the news cycle. Now we come to the part of this story that may ultimately carry the most historical weight. Not the strikes themselves, not the casualties, but what is happening inside the political coalition that brought this administration to power. The MAGA movement, as a political identity, as a mobilizing force, as a coalition held together by a specific set of promises, defined itself in significant part through opposition to foreign wars and Middle Eastern entanglements. This was not a footnote. It was foundational. It was repeated at rallies, embedded in campaign rhetoric, and stated explicitly by the president himself on multiple occasions. And the promise was direct. American kids would not be sent to fight and die in the Middle East. That promise is now broken, and the people who believed it most completely are the ones saying so the loudest. Prominent conservative commentators and influencers, people who spent years building substantial audiences on the ideas of America First foreign policy, non-interventionism, and opposition to what they called forever wars, are now publicly asking questions that would have been unthinkable inside that coalition just months ago. They are asking where the voices who campaigned on these principles have gone. They are pointing to the video record. They are noting that the promises are documented, time-stamped, and irrefutable. One of those voices went further. By speaking about the 4 American service members who had died in connection with the conflict at the time of reporting, the commentator said something remarkable. The sentiment expressed was that those soldiers did not die for the United States. They died for another country's strategic interests. Read that carefully. This is not a progressive critique coming from outside the coalition. This is someone from inside, someone who helped generate the political energy that brought this administration to power, drawing a line and refusing to cross it. That is a rupture, not a policy disagreement, a rupture in the fundamental compact that held the coalition together. On the floor of the House, a Democratic congressman used language that intentionally invoked recent history. He referenced the lead-up to the Iraq War, and he invoked the weapons of mass destruction narrative. He drew a direct parallel, and he closed with a question that cuts to the heart of the domestic contradiction. Billions of dollars a day are being spent on a military operation, while domestic policy commitments, health care, economic support for working Americans, sit unaddressed. How, he asked, is this the agenda that was promised? The polls reflect the political reality. A CNN poll published in the days following the strikes found that nearly 6 in 10 Americans disapprove of the airstrikes on Iran. 59% say they do not trust the president's judgment on the use of military force regarding Iran. And 60%, 6 in 10 Americans, do not believe the president has a clear plan for how to handle the situation. Those numbers deserve careful attention. This is not partisan opposition in the traditional sense. When 6 in 10 Americans across political identities say they do not trust the commander-in-chief's judgment on an active military operation, that is not a poll result. That is a legitimacy crisis unfolding in real time. The financial dimensions of this story are not separate from the political and human dimensions. They are part of the same structure. The estimated operational cost of this conflict is $1 billion per day. That figure has been reported across multiple outlets and has not been seriously disputed. If the conflict continues through September, as the administration has suggested it might, the direct operational cost approaches $150 billion. And that does not account for the strategic cost of degraded weapons stockpiles, the concern the military advisors raised before any of this began. Those stockpiles take years to rebuild. The industrial capacity to produce the munitions being expended in this conflict is not unlimited, and it was already under strain from prior commitments. For anyone working in defense manufacturing, the demand signals are real, but so is the capacity constraint. For anyone working in the energy sector, Iranian oil is effectively off the global market for the duration of this conflict. For anyone whose livelihood depends on regional economic stability, through trade relationships, shipping lanes, or investment exposure, the Middle East is not a closed system. Disruptions there move through the arteries of the global economy with remarkable speed and in ways that are difficult to fully anticipate in advance. The Strait of Hormuz is approximately 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Through it passes roughly 20% of the world's daily oil transit. Iran has repeatedly and explicitly threatened to close that strait in the event of military escalation. If it closes, even temporarily, even partially, the energy price shock that follows does not stay in the Gulf. It travels immediately into every economy on the planet. Europe, already navigating years of energy supply reconfiguration, would feel it acutely. Asia, which depends on Gulf oil at a scale that dwarfs Western consumption, would feel it almost immediately. And American consumers, and already watching their energy costs with anxiety, would see the effects at the pump within days. This is precisely what the military advisors were warning about. Not just American lives, the broader architecture of a global economy that is, by most serious assessments, significantly more fragile than it was during the last major American military engagement in the region. The geopolitical signals are already visible. Defense sector stocks moved sharply in one direction, airline and shipping stocks moved in the other. The war premium embedded in energy futures, the pricing of political risk by people whose professional obligation is to price it accurately, shifted noticeably in the hours following confirmation of the strikes. Major institutional financial players were already issuing guidance to clients about exposure and repositioning. And this is not symbolic. This is capital moving in response to real risk calculations made by people who have significant financial stakes in getting it right. And there is a specific and painful irony running through the domestic political dimension of this story. The Americans most likely to bear the human cost of a prolonged conflict. The working class communities that enlist at rates far higher than their wealthy counterparts. The families who send their children into military service because it represents a pathway to education and economic stability. These communities are among the core constituencies of the coalition that was explicitly promised no more foreign wars. That is not merely a political observation. It is a moral accounting that does not quietly resolve itself when the news cycle moves forward. There are, at this point, two identifiable paths forward. They are not equal in their likely consequences. The first path is a negotiated exit. Iranian leadership, having absorbed significant military damage, signals through intermediary channels. Oman and Qatar have historically served this function. A conditional willingness to engage in talks. The administration frames whatever results from those negotiations as a decisive victory. The strikes are described as the leverage that made diplomacy possible. Some form of agreement is announced. The conflict does not escalate further. The political fracture within the coalition gets managed by the narrative of success. For this path to work, someone on the Iranian side must conclude that the costs of continued conflict outweigh whatever strategic value the confrontation has delivered. And someone on the American side must be willing to define winning in terms that make an exit politically survivable. Neither condition is guaranteed, but neither is impossible. The second path is escalation. An Iranian proxy group, or Iran itself, carries out a retaliatory strike against American assets or personnel in the region. The administration faces a choice it cannot easily navigate. Absorbing the strike quietly is politically untenable. Responding escalates the conflict. A response invites further retaliation. The situation becomes explicitly regional. Other actors, and there are many watching this conflict with calculations of their own, begin adjusting their behavior based on the new reality. So the diplomatic architecture that has contained the Middle East imperfectly but functionally begins to fracture under the weight of events moving faster than anyone anticipated. At that point, the estimate of $1 billion per day starts to look conservative. The political fracture within the coalition moves from damaging to potentially decisive. and the gap between what was promised and what was delivered becomes impossible to manage through any available narrative. A congressman, reflecting on the sequence of shifting justifications, put it starkly on the House floor. The stated rationale had moved in rapid succession from imminent threat to regime change to nuclear weapons back to imminent threat, all within a matter of hours. Now, his reading of this pattern was that it described an administration that made a decision and then searched for a reason, not the other way around. The military advisors warned about the costs before it started. The intelligence community raised questions that were not resolved. Allied governments were not fully informed before the operation began, as evidenced by the thousands of American citizens stranded across the region in the immediate aftermath, people who were not warned that the security environment around them was about to change dramatically. And through all of it, the political machinery of the Republican Party largely aligned behind the decision. And not because the arguments were coherent. Members of Congress attending classified briefings said explicitly that they were not, but because institutional loyalty has its own momentum, until the momentum breaks. And the cracks in that machinery are now visible in ways that are difficult to reverse, because cracks, once they appear in structures under stress, tend to propagate. Here is the factual architecture of what has occurred. The United States entered a major military conflict with a significant regional power. It did so without a coherent and consistently stated objective. It did so over the documented objections of senior military leadership. It did so with a political coalition at home visibly fracturing in public, on video. It is doing so at an estimated cost of $1 billion per day. And it has produced casualty figures that include approximately 150 people killed in a single strike that investigators believe was carried out by American forces. That is the summary. Not an interpretation, not a political judgment. The factual record as it currently stands. The question that history will eventually have to answer is not simply whether the military objectives were achieved. It is whether the full cost of those objectives, human, financial, political, strategic, was ever honestly calculated before the first order was given, and if it was calculated by whom and whose calculation was ultimately privileged. You have seen this structure before, not necessarily in this form, but the architecture, the decision made, the reason constructed afterward, the internal dissent documented and set aside, as the coalition asked to believe what contradicts what it was previously told. This is not without precedent in American history. The question each generation has to answer for itself is whether it can recognize the structure while it is still forming, before the full cost has been paid. No one can tell you yet how this ends. Not the analysts, not the generals, not the administration, and not the commentators who have been tracking every development. The situation is genuinely fluid in ways that make confident prediction dishonest, but the conditions under which the outcome will be determined, the political fractures, the financial pressures, the credibility gaps, the human cost, the strategic constraints, those conditions are visible right now, to anyone willing to look at them steadily and without the distortion of partisan loyalty. So here is the question worth sitting with, not as a political partisan, but as someone trying to understand how power actually works in the world. When the final accounting comes, and it always does, who will have paid the price for the distance between what was promised and what was delivered? And more importantly, what does it mean that we already know with reasonable certainty who it will not be? The answer to that question is not hidden. It is not classified. It is right there in the structure of the story, if you are willing to follow it all the way to the end.